special guest this evening is Cheryl Costa. And Cheryl Costa is in Syracuse. She is a Syracuse, New York resident and a native of Corning, New York. She served in the United States military twice. She served in the U.S. Air Force as a telephone cable technician with service in Vietnam. Later in the U.S. Navy, she served as an electronics tech working with radar and advanced surveillance electronic systems. Professionally, she was a senior information assurance engineer for a top Fortune 100 aerospace company from which she recently retired after 32 years. As a vocation, she was a talk radio personality in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area from 1998 to 2001, where she hosted a weekly radio program on Business Talk, WMET, 1150 a.m. And the program was called The X Factor. For 2 hours every Saturday night, she and her other guests, or author guests, captivated listeners with discussions of unidentified flying objects, ghost hunting, remote viewing, archeo-astronomy, paranormal phenomena, spirituality, cryptozoology, time travel, alien abductions, and much more. And in July of 2013, she began writing UFO-oriented newspaper column called New York Skies for the Syracuse NewYorkTimes.com. And since the launch, the column has enjoyed huge web readership and has an international following. Cheryl Costa was raised Roman Catholic, became a witch in 1978. She's initiated in the Alexandrian tradition and cross-initiated in a handful of small eclectic traditions. She taught basic craft to several hundred students over the years. From 1991 to 1992, she produced the first publicly televised cable television program by witches about witches. The program was called Kestrel and Company and was on cable systems in the Washington, D.C. area for several years. In 2014, as part of a Bachelor of Arts degree program, this thesis project, she wrote and produced an academic documentary about the witch history of Kestrel and Company, show titled When Witchcraft Came Out of the Broom Closet. Cheryl is also an ordained Tibetan Orthodox Buddhist nun and currently serves as an ordained Nagakmi, I know I butchered that, I apologize, yogi. And please welcome Cheryl to the show this evening. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Very good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great, and thank you for joining us tonight. It's quite a pleasure to have you on, so thank you for staying up this late hour with us.
You know, a couple of months ago, this would have been really easy when I was working a 6:30 p.m. to 3 a.m. shift. But the last couple, 2-3 months, I've been working a normal shift, so I'm on normal 9 to 5 hours. So this is very late for me. So I took a nap. I'm good. I'm good to go.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad to hear that. So where do we start here? My goodness, you have had quite a life. So let's talk a little bit. Let's dive into the UFO for a little bit here, and let's kind of talk about how you actually got involved in the UFO phenomenon in general.
Well, okay. The short, long story is this. I was always kind of a UFO bystander. I had seen my first one when I was about 12 with my parents. We were driving one Sunday afternoon. We saw the silver ball hanging out there in the clear blue sky for about 20 minutes, and then the thing just, bam, took off and went lickety-split, and that was my first experience. And it was kind of a thing that kind of drew my mother and me together. So we used to hit the libraries, and if I found a book, I'd read it and tell her about it. And she found a book, she'd read it and tell me about it. And that was it. And then a number of years ago, back around 1990, I had some serious abdominal surgery. And a friend of mine let me stay at his house because I was between apartments at the time that this happened. And he had about every book ever written on UFOs. And he was a Wiccan guy. And his father was dying of cancer. So he was taking care of his father, and he just said, here, feed the cat and pay the utilities. And the place didn't have cable, so I had a lot of books to read. And that's all fine and dandy. It's all in the past. And then in 2012, I read an article that said that UFOs had been decreasing since the 1980s, and maybe they were all just an urban legend anyway. And I said, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That was an article on CNN.com. I said, that doesn't sound right. So just for fun, I went on to a site called the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, and I went into their database, and I started cranking numbers one night. I'd never done this before, but I started cranking numbers. I used to do data analysis when I worked in aerospace, and I know how to work with numbers. And the next thing you know, I got done, and I had a couple of charts and graphs, and I was sitting there looking at them, and I said, you know, if UFOs were supposed to have been decreasing since the 1980s, what memo didn't the UFOs get? Because the chart went very low and went very parabolic. It took right off and went up. And I'm going, who are the people that wrote this article? What line were they trying to feed us here? And that's what got me going. So I got this hairy idea about the idea of writing a weekly column, or I shouldn't even say weekly. I was hoping to be more than that. And I went around to about 12 different editors. In fact, the first one I approached, I said, hey, what would you say if I told you there had been 18 UFO sightings within 8 blocks of this newspaper? And the editor looked up at me that night and said, and what brand of tinfoil do you wear on your head? And it went like that for many months. I was getting laughed out of a lot of editors' offices. And then one Friday afternoon, I happened to have an interview with the Syracuse. By the way, it's called the Syracuse New Times.
Okay, great. Thank you.
SyracuseNewTimes.com. And I got together with the editor there and told him roughly what I wanted to do in like a couple of words, expecting to get thrown out of the office. And he asked me what books I had read, and I started telling him a few, and he started telling me a few he had read, and next thing you know, I realized I had a sympathetic ear. So he was patient enough to let me show him my presentation slides, which I did, and he let me start writing a column.
Excellent.
It took a couple of months, and the intent was, let's do this as an online part. They were trying to goose up their web service, their web edition, and he wanted to experiment with the idea of web columnists on his online edition. So he tried an experiment with 3 of us, and my column went through the roof pretty quickly.
Nice.
And we were very, very, we knew it would probably do well. We thought it might go viral because there wasn't anything like it, I don't talk about the most sensational. This is the one thing I don't do. I don't talk about the most. I have people ask me all the time, well, what's the latest sighting? I have no idea. I don't talk about the latest sighting. There's always an bright, shiny moment out there. I don't talk about them. I dig into the databases, and I find the stories that weren't reported 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And basically, I decided to report the news, all the news the mainstream press hasn't been telling you. And my beat is New York State. And I basically tell you about the New York State sightings, and that's why the column's called New York Skies.
Excellent. That's awesome. So can you go into a little bit of detail as far as some of the some examples of some of the articles that you captured over the past 15, 20, or 40 years?
Well, actually, they go back further than that. The oldest known documented sighting in New York State is from 1790.
Wow.
And it was in Scolari County, which is up near the state capital. It's near there. In those days, it was Dutch settlers up in doing farming, probably tobacco. And this German or Dutch settler said it was middle of summer, and it was about twilight, almost sunset, and he said he was playing his fiddle on his porch, at his cabin, and all of a sudden he heard a tremendous roar, and coming from the northern sky, there was a brightness coming, and eventually it came down about a couple hundred yards from his house. And he said it was long. It was probably over 100, maybe 200 feet long. On one end, it sort of looked like, and if you hold your hand out with your fingers out like a claw, he says it kind of looked like a tree uprooted, and then it tapered off like a snake. And because it was hot, after it had come down and was hovering above the ground, it was sparking, kind of like a hot iron would on an anvil,
Mm-hmm.
And he said it was as big around as a remember, this guy's a couple hundred yards away. He said as big as around as a hog, a big pig, and it moved across hovering above the ground at the speed of a galloping horse. And when it met up to a small hill, it simply met the rise of the hill, went up over it, and that was the last he saw of it. And he swore out his account about 2 years later in the county seat. And that's how it comes to us through the Historical Society.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's so neat to look back on that timeline and access this information. I really appreciate you doing this. I don't think many people are doing that, are they?
No, they aren't. In fact, that's the fact that I'm specializing in one state's sightings. It was the old idea coming from my activist friends taught me this years ago. You know, the old idea of think globally, act locally.
Right.
And I thought, well, let me carve out this interesting niche of just New York State. And every now and then usually the articles are some older sighting. Now some people say, well, big deal about the older sightings. Well, we found out that the older sightings are extremely popular. I got a couple from the Civil War era. I got them from the late 1890s, that type of thing. And I have a lot of people come to me and say, "Oh, UFOs, they're just a modern phenomenon since the 1940s." No. They go back to biblical times. But in terms of New York State, I could probably count 24 sightings between 1790 and the beginning of the 20th century.
Oh, that's fascinating.
That we know about.
That's incredible. And it sounds like, do these seem like crafts from some of the description? It sounds like it, or would it have been perhaps a comet or something like that? Do you ever look at it on a scientific level, or what do you think?
I do. I'll give you one. There was one called, the article was called Chariots of Fire, and it was in 1860. And it was a hot August night in New York City. New York City in those days, if you'd ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, the buildings were pretty much just two-story wooden buildings. If it went up 5 stories, that was pretty much the limit because they didn't really have elevators in those days. But everything was pretty much limited to not much taller than 5 stories, and it was all wood for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a hot August night evening around 9 or so, 9:30 or so, and people saw these 2 brilliant balls of fire going from north to south across the horizon. The newspaper made the very strange, interesting comment of saying it took almost a minute. In fact, the reporter, 2 different reporters in 2 different cities made the same comment, that the 2 balls of fire were not like a typical meteor where you look up and say, "Oh my God, look at that! Oop, it's gone." You know, no, this took almost a minute for it to cross the horizon. So the story, what was cool about the story was the researcher that I got it from had news clippings from Albany, New York, New York City paper, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and Norfolk, Virginia. So I laid out a timeline based on the times that were said by the reporters of each of these papers. And it traveled a distance of about 470 miles north to south from its people, where people were seeing it in Albany, New York, till it got to like Norfolk, Virginia, went into a cloud bank. And that was the last anybody saw it. Well, we did some calculations with a pilot friend of mine about how long something would take to go across the night horizon. And that's about a 60-mile window as you look at it. And we calculated that whatever this was moving about 1,700 to about 3,500 miles per hour. The meteors that came in over Russia 2 years ago blew up, okay, whatever it was. That came in at 45 or 50,000 miles per hour. That's the speed meteors come in at. This was moving at a speed that is comparable to some of our supersonic craft that fly, a couple of times faster than the speed of sound, or that 3,200 miles per hour I was talking about. That's about the speed of a space shuttle when it's at about 100,000 feet.
Interesting.
So after I wrote it up, that I truly believe that this was an atmospheric entry event by some craft.
Certainly sounds like it. Yeah, and I love the way you explain it. I so appreciate that.
There was one up in I believe it was 1883 off the top of my head. It was up around Niagara Falls. a large cube-shaped UFO hovered over the falls for the better part of 3 hours. And then when about middle of the afternoon, it stopped hovering and flew around, the 19th century Buffalo, New York for about 15 minutes and then gone,
Wow.
And that's one of the cool ones. 1879, there was an astronomer in New Jersey. You got to understand, he spotted something hovering over New York Harbor. Now, the cool thing is, you got to remember that New York Harbor in 1879 was predominantly still masted sailing ships.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And whatever this thing was, he got angles on it. He tried to give it to a New York City paper. The New York Times wouldn't talk to him. And there was another paper at the time that did, and they published his letter. He also had his letter with his astronomical readings and measurements and everything published in Scientific American. And there were a lot of people who scoffed at it, but apparently other astronomers in the regional New York area, southern Connecticut area, saw it as well and had similar measurements. And when all these astronomical measurements were made, they estimate that the thing, whatever it was about 102 miles above the Earth. Well, that's not really geosynchronous orbit like we think of, as a satellite that sits out there and is over the same spot of the Earth at the same time. Okay, that's 24,000 miles out. This was 102 miles out. Still, it's outer space. 62 miles is outer space, is the actual line where they say this is now outer space. This was at 102 miles and had to be moving at some incredible speed in order to keep up with the rotation of the Earth in order to hover over New York Harbor for 12 hours.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Now, add to that the measurements that they all got, these astronomers, when they put their numbers together, whatever it was estimated to be a half a mile in diameter.
Wow. That's incredible.
So we wrote it up as, quote, the proverbial mothership that hovered over New York Harbor in 1879.
Yeah, no kidding. So was that the description of it? Did they actually give a more detailed description of the craft or what it was?
Just a large dish-shaped object hovering over New York Harbor.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's really incredible. So many people don't know about this.
And, well, what's funny is I have people say to me all the time, New York State, you write about New York State's UFOs? Well, can there be all that many? Well, everybody assumes that because they don't hear about them, they think there aren't any. Mm-hmm. We average, on an average in New York State, depending upon what you might call low season and high season, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Like the winter months are the low season, and the warmer months from about May to about September, maybe October, are what we would call the high season, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So in the winter months, we average somewhere between 15 to 30 in New York State. And as you get into the warmer months, we average somewhere on the order of about 50 to 80. Okay? Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example. In 2014, we had, combining both the National UFO Reporting Center's database and the MUFON database, we had 540 sightings in New York State.
It's quite a bit.
And that's the reported ones. And there's an estimate out there that probably only 1 in 10 people reports what they saw.
And Cheryl, we had a request if you could speak up a little bit louder. Someone requested that in chat, if that's okay.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I can hear you, but it's harder to tell if everybody else can hear you just as well. So
yeah, I wasn't sure.
Thank you.
Another thing that comes up is that people say that they wonder about, well, if there are only 1 out of 10 people are citing them, how many sightings do we really have? And again, do the math. If only 1 out of 10, and I had 540 last year, which was a strong year. The last few years have been around somewhere between about 380 and about 480 a year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and last year was a kind of a peaking year. So that gives you an idea, I think.
Oh, absolutely. That's quite a bit.
Yeah,
no doubt about
much
that.
more than people realize. And New York State gets about 3 to 5% of the world's sightings. We're in states in North America, we come in around about number 5 or number 6, depending upon the year.
That's really interesting. What's number 1? Do you know offhand?
California.
Is it? Okay, I was just curious. What about Colorado?
Colorado's up there. I don't have it off the top of my head, but Colorado's up there.
That's fascinating. It's
in the top. I know Colorado's in the top 10.
Is it? Yeah, that's really interesting. When you look back on the timelines, obviously this is off-world intelligence of some kind. If I were to look at it on this timeline, I would say, well, maybe it's a black technology, and we're witnessing black craft, covert technology and this and that. But yeah, some of this stuff, there's an off-world intelligence associated.
There's two schools of thought on this. Is it off-world intelligence, or is it a intelligence coming from what I'm going to call another dimension, another reality? And there's two schools of thought. In fact, actually, there's 3 schools of thought. One school of thought that says they're off-worlders. One school of thought says it's from a different reality. And the other school of thought says it's a little bit of both.
That makes sense.
And if you talk to the folks who study Bigfoot, there are an incident of a lot of unidentified flying objects around those times. And there was one farmer down in Pennsylvania a few years ago. They were shooting at a couple of them, and then one of them kind of came up into their backyard and stood there and looked at them, the big hairy Bigfoot guy, and they started to raise their shotguns, and he kind of waved a finger at them, and then raised something up in his hand like he was like he had some device about the size of a pack of cigarettes. He went click and disappeared.
Interesting.
Okay. Yeah, and I've heard a couple of accounts like that. So, not that I track that kind of story very much. I'm not really into the Bigfoot. I do have a lot of people say, well, particularly from the journalists that bug me, they say, well, you're not reporting this like a traditional journalist. You can't prove this. I said, I don't have to prove this. I do not have to prove this. I report what people say they saw, and eyewitness testimony will get you thrown into prison in any court in this country.
Yeah, no kidding.
So this is one of the big fallacies about this whole topic matter. If this was any other phenomena, eyewitness testimony is adequate. Okay? Here we are in this topic matter, and everybody comes to me and says, Cheryl, you don't have any proof. You and your peers in this field don't have any proof. Well, I have lots of proof. I have thousands upon thousands of eyewitness sightings, and of course people say, well, they got to be nuts, or they got to be hallucinating, or they've got to be all these other things. But when you crank them back against what they call a standard formula for this was something that was misidentified atmospheric thing, or it was just birds, or it was stars in the sky, and somebody didn't realize what it was, and nuts and all that. Nuts are only about 2%. About 20% are completely unexplainable and get into that real gray area of what the heck was it? And so that's a big thing to keep in consideration. The other thing I tell people, to me, is proof. I get censored. Not by my editors, but I do get censored. And the censorship takes place in the form of my editor and my publisher at the paper laugh about this because they know that it took me a long time to convince them that I was being censored. My my column has very high page views. Okay, very, very, very popular column. I've got international readership. Okay, we know this because we got a web newspaper, right? And they also have a print paper, but I'm only in the web edition. And if I mention an article where Susie and her parents were at the ice cream stand and they saw the 3 glowing discs go over, followed by a couple of fighter jets, you can't find me on the internet. You can't find me on Google. If I mention you need to write your congressman to tell them you want citizen hearings on disclosure about what the government knows about UFOs, you can't find me on Google.
Wow.
Now, and there's a couple of other little categories like that, and it's a running joke. There's my editor has a little chart in his office about all the things Cheryl will get censored on, and we found out with Mr. Snowden that the NSA has had their fingers into Google for years. Okay, so what? Who else has their fingers into it?
Right.
And doesn't want this out there. So my proof is censorship and eyewitness testimony.
Yep, absolutely. And have those people that censor your site, do they ever contact you in person?
Oh God, no.
No, I wouldn't think so. Yeah, I was just curious.
No, I've got on a normal week, I've got thousands and thousands of page views.
Mm-hmm.
On one of the weeks where I'm getting censored, like I said, you can't find me on Google. I don't even seem to get out of Syracuse. I'll have page views in the 15 or 20 or 30 or for under 100 on those weeks.
That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah,
well, you're
like
doing
I
something
never got out of Syracuse.
Jeez. Yeah, obviously they know what's going on your orbit. Well,
and we know how to tune. Websites can be tuned. With keywords and what they call the SEO tuning and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we know how to do it. We're a newspaper. We know how to tune these things. Nope. If I mention those key subject matter, in fact, we ran a couple of experiments, and if I mention the 3 major categories, like I said, you can't find me on Google.
Wow, that's something else. Yeah, well, you're doing something right there. Then, yeah, it's amazing. Once again, it's all this obfuscation. You have to ask yourself, why are they still doing this when it's obvious that there's UFOs, obviously in one form or another. So why do you think they're doing that? Why do you think they just want to keep doing damage control?
Well, they've had this policy since the 50s. With the Robinson panel that basically took the position that the average public can't handle the truth, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then Dr. Condon came out with his assessment in 1968, and in fact, the New York Times published the entire thing because it basically said it's all hogwash. And there's been 15 different PhD papers done against that report since that time that says it's baloney. Mm-hmm. But the problem is when that Condon report came out and said we're not going to have government funding for this because it's baloney and all this kind of stuff, the newspaper and the press and the media industry took the position that, oh well, this is baloney, and those people who see him are hysterical, or they're crazy, or they're hoaxes, or just publicity seekers. They've taken this attitude. I've got editors up here. They ask me, well, you've ruined your journalism career by reporting this stuff every week. And I said, yeah, but I'm reporting something that you guys don't report, and I've got more page views than your paper does. So tell me what's wrong here. Well, everybody's just being true believers. No, they're not. They know something's going on, and you people are part of the conspiracy to not do your job and report the news.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Too much damage control, without a doubt. I know you touched a little bit on the UFO with the Civil War. You didn't really elaborate on it. I was wondering if you can kind of go into that a little bit.
Oh, well, the only other, they were both Civil War era.
Okay.
There was another one in New York City. There was a huge fire down in the area of the area called Five Points. It was very notorious. A lot of immigrants went there, and it was a place you get your throat cut real easy. And this about midnight, and this woman, it was in summertime, she looked out her attic apartment and saw what she thought to be a flaming cross in the sky, a shiny flaming cross in the sky. Well, and this was confessed to a priest. And paper, you got to remember, paper was a very valuable commodity in those days. It was not as common as it is now. So this comes to us scribbled in the margins of a baptismal record from a particular church. Okay. In fact, my editor made me give him a PDF of that page because he didn't believe it. Okay.
Wow.
And I got it from the researcher. And the thing was, the modern researcher went back and wanted to see if anybody reported it in the newspapers of that time. And what they found was that there was a couple of blocks away, there was a huge block-sized fire. Remember I said in 1860, 1861, the buildings were wood. Well, there was a whole block on fire. It was a warehouse, a laboratory, and a couple of other warehouses. It was an industrial area, and the entire block went up. Okay, so imagine how bright a fire that would be. Now imagine if there was a shiny fuselage of some kind of a craft hovering above, like say something shaped similar to a modern airplane, hovering above the city. All that light from that fire would appear to reflect off that hull. Okay, and that's what the modern researcher believes happened.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I like looking at the old historical archives. That's great. And how do you find these?
Sometimes they're given to me. Sometimes I find them buried in the database. Modern researchers will log them in the database after they have found them. I get some handed down to me. I'll give you an example. What's happened, there's a very interesting phenomena since I've been doing this since July of 2013. Readership is invited to write me. And every now and then I'll get an invitation to meet somebody for a cup of coffee and a burger at the truck stop, or invited over for a hot dog at a family reunion in somebody's backyard, that kind of thing. And I'll come, and the people will be very, very gracious and say, we wanted you to meet our Uncle so-and-so, and he's got a story to tell you. And you sit down, you sit down with a glass of lemonade, and somebody relates a story to you. And the ones that are genuine, you can tell by looking in their eyes because they are living it again. You can tell by looking at them. It is no baloney. The guy or gal usually gets very, very. There's just a look. Believe me. Well, one of the best ones that got handed down to me was from about 1880, spring of 1880. And this was handed down through a family. In fact, these stories are being handed down like family heirlooms.
Nice.
Okay, our great uncle saw this type of thing. Well, there was these two little girls in a place called Cameron Mills, New York. If you look on the New York State map, you find Bath, New York. Well, somewhere south of there in the boonies is a place called Cameron and a place called Cameron Mills. 1880, think Little House on the Prairie kind of motif, if you know what I'm saying, except it's the rolling foothills of upstate New York. About 8 or 10 kids from the farms were walking to their schoolhouse. And this is your classic thing, like your grandmother may have said to you, when I was your age, I walked 7 miles to school when I was a kid, This is one of those situations, okay? And when the kids got to this one bridge of a large creek or a small river they always crossed, they saw some little men, bald little men in blue jumpsuits, or they said they were blue coveralls, down by the water, like they were gathering water into containers. And the little men told them it was okay to come across the bridge and come over and see them. And the kids were frightened, and they ran home. And this story is handed down to us through one of the families.
Wow, that's something else.
And the description, bald little men, and it sounds like Greys or type 3 Edens, So it's I felt very comfortable reporting it. And the family was very, I mean, the member of the family that told me the story over a cup of coffee, she was in her 80s, you know. I had another lady in her 80s told me up in Tioga County, New York, back in the 1930s, she was about 8 years old. And they were coming back, it was Thanksgiving, they were coming back from her grandmother's house in Binghamton, New York, and they were coming up the old road there. In those days, that particular main route was only a 2-lane asphalt road. Okay, now it's like a 8-lane highway, and they were coming up over a rise, and she told her father to stop and pull over. There was something out in the field, and he did. And she said, "What?" He asked her what was out there in the field. She said, "A Greyhound bus." And he said, "What?" They got out of the car. She was in her Sunday best, and much to her mother's chagrin, because her father and her climbed over this fence in this cow pasture. There was cow patties everywhere, and down in the clearing of this pasture was this long silvery thing with like a row of windows across the center part of it. So it sort of did resemble a Greyhound bus of that era. Mm-hmm. And what the deal was, they sat there and looked at it for a couple of minutes, and they thought they could see somebody looking out of the windows, and the thing kind of lifted off, hovered about 10 feet above the ground, and then just shot off into the sky.
Oh, wow.
And her parents refused to talk about it till the day they died.
That's fascinating. Some real interesting stuff there. My goodness.
We had a cool one here. I don't know if you have to take a commercial break.
No, we're good.
Like that.
We have about 10 minutes plus or minus, so yeah.
Okay, very good. I'll tell you the one of 1965. I called the article "The Flying Saucer Whisperer." There was a kid I went to high school with, and I had forgotten about this kid. I barely knew him, but a math teacher that I had in school. I had coffee with this guy about 10 years ago. The math teacher. And he was dying of cancer, and I just happened to bump into him, and he had peace of mind to sit. I was visiting my relatives in Corning, and we sat down and had this nice long chat. And he said, "Do you remember so-and-so?" Vaguely. Yeah, I think I was in gym class with the kid, and our same gym period, so to speak. And he said, many years ago, in 1965, and he was able to nail it down to a particular time. And basically, the kid was one of these kids in school that he was a little on the weird side, but one of the weirdness was the kid was clairvoyant. Okay, so what happened was, as this guy told me, he says the kid one night said to us, I'm gonna call one of those spaceships. Everybody they were sitting on the front porch, having a Kool-Aid and lemonade, a hot summer night, and the kid put his hands over his face and went like he was concentrating or something like that, and he got all done. He says, "Well, I sent them an invitation." Everybody laughed, and everybody went home. It was dusk. Everybody went home. And the goofy thing was the next day in the paper, there were people in town reported they saw UFOs flying at treetop level over the town. And believe me, Corning's a pretty small place. Mm-hmm. So something like that would be very, very significant. And the dates kind of the math teacher told me, he says, I opened the paper and about fell on the floor.
Really?
So
wow.
The reason he shared the story with me is he was getting ready to die of cancer, so he felt comfortable telling it to me. So
I'm certainly glad he did communicate that information. Wow, that's fascinating. Well, I know today even people try to summon ships and things like that, and supposedly they do show up and blip on and off or whatever they do. So that's incredible. That's really amazing. Has there any reports of abductions of any kind?
Yeah, in New York, you don't get a lot of abduction reports in the databases. Mm-hmm. Two things. The people who get abducted are referred to as experiencers. Mm-hmm. I was a speaker out at the International UFO Congress,
right?
Back in the middle of February, the week of the 20th. and I was one of the speakers out there. And one of the things they have at this Congress every year is a thing called the Experiencer Sessions. They have one in the morning and they have one in the evening. It's a private session before all of the other speaking and festivities get going. And the press wasn't welcome, okay? And I've been to this convention before. So I went to the person who led it, who's a psychiatrist, and I said, I'll leave my press credentials out at home. Can I come and sit in on one of these? I won't report on it. I would just like to hear what people say and talk about. So with my taking me at my word, she allowed me to come. And I thought there might be 10 or 12 people in there. There was more like 120 people in there. It was like an AA meeting. Hi, my name is Joe, and I got abducted back in,
Wow.
That's kind of how it went down. And these people, again, remember I told you, when they're telling you the story, you can see it in their eyes.
Right.
The people who really, very clearly, that I could tell, seemed to really be genuine about this, you could tell some of them would start shaking, and when they were telling you what they went with. And there's been a lot of abductions. In New York State, I only had about 4 or 5 that I have documented. And there was a guy back in 1972 up in a place called Canasteel. It's, again, up towards that Bath, New York area I was telling you about. He went out in the middle of January to go hunting, deer hunting. It was still deer season. And he went out around 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, and he figured he'd be back and go out there for an hour, an hour or two, and come back and have breakfast. Okay, and next thing you know, he finds himself sitting on a stump, wondering where he lost almost 8 hours.
Oh wow!
Okay,
yeah, same time.
There was a guy up in the 80s up near Lake George, was having a few drinks out on his cabin. He had a cottage up there on the lake, and they thought they saw some funny lights in the sky, and okay, fine. And the next thing you know, he said they went home. He heard this humming sound. Okay, and when he heard the humming sound, he said it felt like he went to sleep. He felt like it was like he was dozing off. He woke up 3 days. Next thing he remembers is waking up 3 days later, about 8 or 10 miles from home, dressed in somebody else's clothes.
My goodness! Holy cow!
And the cops, they got him. Some people who found him on the roadside got him to the state police. When he told them his story, they thought he was crazy. They took him to a psych ward. They thought he was nuts. And when he finally did get out of all of that, he moved to New York City. He wanted to be around as many people as he could. He did not want to live out in the boonies anymore.
Right. Yeah, I blame him.
That's a couple of the more prominent abduction stories that I've heard from upstate New York.
Wow, that's pretty compelling, you ask me. And of course, with that comes, usually when they get taken, so to speak, they come back after what I've understood, that they come back and actually, whether it's to do an assessment or monitoring or take them again, or very interesting. Is there ever any follow-up on some of these contactees or experiencers?
In what context?
In the sense that, say they get abducted in the 80s and then they fall off the radar, does anybody do a check on them to see if they actually have been taken again?
From what the experiencers told me, is some of these people have told me that them and members of their family, like one guy down there told me that his grandparents has been taken, him and 2 of his siblings have been taken, his kids have been taken. Okay, like it's like they're following certain families, I mean, I kind of joke with a friend of mine. I don't know if you remember the old Mutual of Omaha's, Wild Kingdom in Marlon Perkins, right? and they were also out there tagging rhinoceroses and elephants and things, and I kind of joke with a friend of mine that this is like the intergalactic Marlin Perkins kind of thing. They seem to be tagging certain people and tracking certain genetic lines. Is what it appears to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty wild. I think one of the more interesting phenomena that we're beginning to see is this whole thing with how do I say it, crop circles and such,
mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of people who seem to think that the crop circles are associated with these things, and there's been some pretty good evidence to suggest they might be. Here's the trick. We don't know if it's interdimensional. We don't know if it's extraterrestrial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
I've seen evidence, people say, there are a lot of people say, oh, Roswell couldn't have ever happened. That's where they supposedly had the crash. There's actually two crashes. There was one outside of Roswell, and there's one in what they call Corona, okay? And there was actually two crashes. And, a lot of people blow me away, say, oh, no, that can't, no, that's all baloney, Well, I was doing some other research. They had nothing to do with Roswell.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There was an actor. He was a member of an old UFO group back in the 60s called NICAP, National Investigative something or other. I don't remember what it's called. It was NICAP, but it was very prominent back in the 50s and 60s. And he was a traveling actor, part of a road troupe. And every time he went to some town, he would go through he would spend his afternoons, since the shows were at night, he would spend his afternoons in the libraries going through old papers and also going through microfiche and that kind of thing. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a report in the late 60s that showed there was a 22, 23-day window in June and July 1947, which was when Roswell occurred, where we had some astronomical amount of sightings of UFOs and reports of UFOs in the United States. I found it quite by accident because I was researching 1947 articles in the New York Times. Remember, New York State is my beat.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, in June and July, they were getting UFO reportings from 38 states.
Wow.
And anybody I've ever shown the data to that knows something like what I'm going to call fire and rescue, I have a lot of firemen friends, volunteer fire people, and I showed them the data, and they said, wow, that kind of looks like the kind of activity you have when an airplane goes down and you're calling out the Boy Scouts and the Civil Air Patrol that, there's aircraft down, everybody and their brother comes out looking for them. And, and my joke with one of my UFO friends was this Starship down.
Wow.